Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about the end of World War II, focusing on the events from 1943 to 1945. By the end of the video, you should be able to answer this stuff. Let's begin by looking at the war in Europe in 1942 and 1943, which is seen as the major turning point of the war there. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces are able to stop the Nazi advance, and they begin pushing back towards Germany. And once this advance gets started, it never really stops. The Soviets continue pushing the Germans back until they take Germany in 1945. On the West, the United States and Britain have begun strategic bombing. Strategic bombing is where, instead of attacking military targets, you try to destroy cities and industrial centers controlled by the enemy. So this is a sort of economic warfare where they're trying to destroy Germany's ability to produce war stuff. So they're targeting factories that produce airplanes, factories that produce tanks, factories that produce munitions. So this effectively cripples Germany's military machine, but it also results in a huge civilian death toll. It's estimated that around 500,000 German civilians were killed in these bombings, which is more than the total number of US citizens killed in the entire war. On top of this, the United States and Britain occupy North Africa, pushing Italian and German forces out. And then from there, they are able to successfully invade Italy in 1943. Mussolini is at that point ousted and is later killed by Italian communists. And from this point on, with the US and Britain and Italy and the bombing campaigns and the Soviet Union advancing towards Germany, the success of the Allies seems pretty much certain. In light of this, the three main leaders, Churchill of Great Britain, Roosevelt of the United States, and Stalin of the Soviet Union, collectively known as the Big Three, decide to meet and to discuss post-war politics. They meet several times, but the most famous of these meetings is the Yalta Conference. And at Yalta, they're able to come to a couple important agreements regarding what to do after the war. First, they agree that they are going to continue fighting until the Axis powers surrender unconditionally. So that means that they're not going to stop fighting until the enemy governments are entirely beaten, and then they can rebuild these governments from the ground up. They also insist on the occupation of Germany, and what this means is that after Germany is beat, it will be split up into different zones of occupation, and it will be run sort of as a military state until Germany can be reunited as a more normal sort of nation. And finally, they agree that they will all join the United Nations after the war is over. So the United Nations is going to be a sort of beefed up version of the League of Nations, and this time both the Soviet Union and the United States are going to join, which is going to help this organization be a more effective force for international cooperation. But there are some disagreements. The major disagreement happens between Roosevelt and Stalin. Stalin demands that the Soviet Union be given a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Basically, Stalin wants to take control of all the territories that it is conquering from Nazi Germany. So places like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Stalin believes these places should go to the Soviet Union, or at least be controlled by the Soviet Union after the war. But Roosevelt believes in the old idea of the self-determination of peoples, and that the people in these areas should be free to decide their own form of government. So Stalin and Roosevelt cannot agree on this major issue. The war comes to an end in Europe in 1945. By 1944, Nazi Germany is basically in complete collapse. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet advance appears unstoppable. They continue to advance rapidly through Poland and into Germany. By April 1945, the Soviets capture Berlin, and there is a famous picture there of a Soviet soldier raising the Soviet flag on top of the German parliament building. When this happens, Hitler commits suicide in an underground bunker rather than risk being captured by the Soviets, because who knows what Stalin would do if he ever got his hands on Hitler. So that is the end of Adolf Hitler's story. On the Western Front, things are also advancing. D-Day occurs. D-Day is a huge aquatic or amphibious invasion of northern France. And this is where US, British, and French forces all invade simultaneously. This is a 2.2 million man operation, which makes it the largest amphibious assault in history. This force successfully establishes itself on northern France, and then from there, this enormous force is able to advance through France and through the Netherlands into Germany by 1945. So Germany is basically collapsing from both ends, and by May, U.S. and Russian forces meet in central Germany. They shake hands over the on the line where they meet, and the Nazis surrender unconditionally May 8th, 1945. So the war in Europe ends May 8th. Here's a map of the final years of the war. You can see the Soviet advance from the east, pushing back through all of that territory taken by Germany earlier. And you can see Allied forces advancing up through Italy and simultaneously advancing through France, converging, all of these lines converging in Germany by 1945. Here is a picture of the D-Day Invasion. This is after the landing has occurred, and now cargo ships are coming up and transporting thousands and thousands of vehicles and millions of men into France. So you can see just the incredible amount of material and production that went in to this invasion. And this is only a tiny portion of the total invasion force that you can see here. So even though the Nazis surrender in May of 1945, the war is not yet over because Japan, even though it seems totally beaten, refuses to surrender unconditionally. They demand a couple of conditions, and the United States refuses to grant them. So the United States has already established naval superiority around Japan, and they've begun a massive bombing campaign. And these campaigns are just more or less destroying Japanese cities. So even before the atom bomb comes into play, the United States is using normal bombs and incendiary bombs, that is, fire bombs, to destroy Japanese cities of various sizes. So the Japanese refuse to surrender even though this bombing campaign is going on. And so the president, who is Truman, because Roosevelt dies towards the end of the war, President Truman is faced with a tough choice. To end the war, he could either invade Japan, or he could drop the atom bombs that were developed by the Manhattan Project. So on the one hand, the invasion would take a really long time, and it would cost millions of lives. Millions of Japanese and at least 1 million American soldiers were estimated to die in such an invasion. On top of this, this would allow the Soviet Union time to invade northern Japan, and it could lead to increasing Soviet influence in the area. And the United States was already worried about this because as soon as the war in Europe ends, mistrust builds between the Soviets and the Americans, which will eventually lead to the Cold War. So that was another factor influencing this decision. On top of that, and on the other hand, though, there's the atom bomb. And the atom bomb would end the war quickly, but it would result in hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. And so Truman wasn't originally sure what to do, but he eventually goes with the atom bomb. And so on August 7th, 1945, atom bombs on August 7th and August 9th, atom bombs are dropped on two important Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both of which are completely destroyed. In these single two bombings, between 126,000 and 240,000 Japanese are killed. But even at this point, the Japanese do not surrender, and the United States was preparing to drop even more atom bombs. And on August 12th, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and begins to prepare for an invasion of the Northern Islands. And on August 17th, just a few days before the United States was planning on dropping another atom bomb, Japan surrenders unconditionally, and this brings the war to a close. Here is a picture of Hiroshima after the bombing. You can see that most of the city has been entirely leveled. Where there once were tall buildings, there is now nothing but rubble. And the cities were described famously by one reporter as a graveyard with not a tomb standing. And based on this picture, I would say that that seems like a fairly accurate statement. So anyway, guys, that's how the war ends. This is the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history. And now the question is, how are we going to put the pieces back together and secure a just and lasting peace?